2015, the year of the much politicized surge in families and unaccompanied children arriving at the border, a drought struck the dry corridor. Farmers were still scrambling to recover when another untimely drought hit early this summer, wiping out first harvests of beans and maize. Many of the asylum seekers caught up in Trump's short-lived family separation policy were indigenous Guatemalan farmers fleeing the specter of starvation. The interplay between climate change and migration can be complex. Many Central Americans displaced by hurricane or drought first relocate within their home countries, a rule that holds true worldwide. They often face gang violence, marginal employment, and racial discrimination. When they later flee to Mexico or the United States, Garcia said, the original cause of their displacement is obscured, leading to an undercount of climate-driven refugees. Nobody knows how many people climate change will displace globally. At the high end, the UK-based Christian Aid predicts there will be 1 billion environmental migrants by 2050. A more typical estimate is 200 million. Of those, an unknown number will cross international borders, and no country is ready to receive them. Climate refugees are not recognized by the United Nations or any government. The closest thing in the United States is temporary protected status, a designation that shields migrants from deportation to areas devastated by natural disasters, which Trump is currently shredding. When it comes to refugee policy, there's a total refusal to deal with the reality of climate change, Garcia said. Trump rejects reality altogether. In October, he claimed the climate will simply change back again. Still, his policies have a certain cruel logic. A flood of climate refugees is coming, and the choices are stark. Develop a generous asylum policy and mitigate the impacts of climate change with investment abroad, or build walls high enough to stem the tide. So, just something to think about, because we talk a lot about economic issues. That tends to be the main source of how am I trying to say this? Sometimes my brain just goes blank. The main choice when it comes to describing why people migrate. We talk about, well, they're looking for jobs. Okay, yeah, they are looking for jobs, but they are looking for jobs in a place that they think they can find jobs. They're looking for jobs because they need to work in order to live, and they come here to be safe is the main reason. So gang violence, yes, that's a big problem. But what contributes to this kind of violence? Well, the U.S. contributes to the drug trade throughout Central and South America because we consume such huge amounts of drugs. So there is one way that the U.S. is creating the problem that people are fleeing from that brings them to the U.S. So that is one thing, our consumption of illegal drugs. Gang violence is associated generally with the drug trade, so that's a big part of it. So the violence and the drug trade go hand in hand. They're both two parts of a whole, as well as unstable governments that exist partly or mostly because we have been messing around with these governments in these countries for many years. Throughout the Cold War era, every time somebody even looked halfway like they thought they were going to be communist or socialist or something like that, we interfered with their government. So the lack of a stable government long term is, again, in a large part the fault of the United States. And when people flee from that, we once again blame them for their own problems that we helped to create. So now climate change is creating difficulties in these very same countries that are already suffering from these other things that we're just talking about. And again, climate change has been largely driven by the developed nations who have all gone through their phases of using lots of coal and gas and all those things which contribute to global warming. And now whenever we do address the topic, we generally say, well, you shouldn't use coal. You shouldn't burn down your rainforests. You shouldn't do all these things to these countries who are trying to get to the same kind of general standard of living that we have. But we already created a big mess by getting ourselves to this point, and now we're telling other people that they can't do it. They can't do the same things we did because it's causing the problems that we already caused. So there again, you have another problem that is not just the United States, but many developed countries around the world, or developing countries around the world, have contributed to this. And once again, we're trying to keep out the people who are being displaced by this. So there are any number of reasons why people are coming here, and not a lot of good reasons why we're turning them away, except that we would rather not face the consequences of our own actions, and we'd rather not deal with any problems that may arise from someone coming here and wanting a place to stay, even though we have lots and lots of room, and we could easily accommodate huge numbers of people coming here on a regular basis. But don't listen to me. Well, no, you should listen to me. I mean, that's why you tune into this show, because you're listening to me, and I appreciate that. But again, I feel like I am mostly preaching to the choir, as they say, and talking to people who already know this stuff, who already agree with this stuff, and who are sitting there going, well, yeah, I knew that. And the people who don't know this are generally not listening, and or would never think of tuning in, or they would tune in long enough to go, oh, he's trying to encourage immigrants to come here. He's wrong. He shouldn't do that. And pardon the accent, but that was my way of describing another person speaking, not myself. So it is an accent other than my own. Not to say that necessarily everyone with a southern-ish or western-ish accent is not a good person. So I apologize in case you got that impression from me. Sorry. It's very dry in here and very hot as well. So let us continue. So as long as we're talking about Trump, and it seems impossible to discuss this topic without discussing this dude, here's an interesting article that I ran across that discusses that very person. And it is entitled, Will Donald Trump Leave Any Lasting Policy Legacy? That's a good question. I'd like to know. So, presidents want to leave a lasting legacy. If you believe Donald Trump, he has already left a lasting imprint. From a tweet by Donald Trump, quote, the Trump administration has accomplished more than any other U.S. administration in its first 2, not even, years of existence, and we are having a great time doing it. All of this despite the fake news media, which has gone totally out of its mind, truly the enemy of the people. That's the president speaking. So, it is not surprising that President Trump would say this, even though the last time he said this, he almost got laughed out of the building. To be fair, however, more neutral observers agree that Trump has left his imprint on particular policies. There is no denying that Trump is leaving his imprint on the federal judiciary, and the Tax Cut and Jobs Act is in effect. 538's Perry Bacon Jr. notes that Trump's effect on immigration policy has been considerable even without any appreciable funding for a wall. Trump, in his 2 years in office, has already made U.S. policy much, much more resistant to immigration, without Congress agreeing to his wall or really any of his immigration ideas. There is no physical wall, but there are all kinds of new barriers for people who want to come to the United States and for undocumented immigrants who want to stay. He has data to back him up. On the other hand, the Washington Post's Robert Costa and Philip Rucker have quite a paragraph tucked into the middle of their article about White House Chief of Staff John F. Kelly's planned departure. Quote, facing the dawn of his third year in office and his bid for re-election, Trump is stepping into a political hailstorm. Democrats are preparing to seize control of the House in January with subpoena power to investigate corruption. Global markets are reeling from his trade war. The United States is isolated from its traditional partners. The investigation by Special Counsel Robert S. Mueller III into Russian interference is intensifying, and court filings Friday in a separate federal case implicated Trump in a felony. End quote. I mean, that's certainly a legacy, but not exactly one that any president would want. It's more appropriate for a Star Wars opening crawl, and matters have gotten worse since that article was published Saturday. Nick Ayers, Trump's choice to replace Kelly, declined the job because he refused to commit to 2 years. With Trump now scrambling for a replacement, possible candidates keep withdrawing from consideration. According to Politico's Nancy Cook, the list of potential replacements for Kelly shrinking by the hour. Pro tip: when no one wants to be your chief of staff, that is a sign that your administration might not be leaving the best and most lasting legacy. This story dovetails nicely with two of my Post colleagues' arguments from late last week about Trump's incompetence getting the better of his administration's policy efforts. Greg Sargent argued that on almost every facet of Trump's foreign policy, China, trade wars, trade deficits, and immigration, he has sabotaged his own agenda. Similarly, Max Boot looks at Trump's latest screw-ups, U.S. relations with Saudi Arabia, the turmoil at Justice, overall White House chaos, and concludes that the president's incompetence undercuts his malevolence. Quote, President Trump is either oblivious to or simply disdainful of what for good reason has become conventional wisdom in politics. No president has attempted more cover-ups and with less success. This administration can't do anything right. Even its cover-ups are incompetent. That is, of course, its saving grace. Trump would be far more dangerous if he were more adept at concealing evidence of his misdeeds, end quote. So on the one hand, Trump is having an effect on some areas of policy. On the other, many of his efforts seem hapless and unfocused. Is it possible to reconcile these two contrasting narratives? I believe so. First, one has to acknowledge that the appointments to the judiciary do represent a legacy, though that has much to do with Senate Majority Mitch McConnell and the Federalist Society, as with Trump. Second, and more important, almost everything else that the Trump administration has done could be undone by the next president. In 2021, Trump's successor could completely reverse all of his immigration and foreign policies without much effort. There are no new bureaucracies or agencies that exist because of Trump, particularly if the Space Corps never comes to pass. Trump's predecessor faced this problem to a lesser degree. Many of his signature foreign policies, the Iran deal, the Paris climate deal, and the Cuba opening, were executive branch-only exercises. Trump was able to reverse all three. This is a function of what some scholars describe as executive-centered partisanship. Still, three factors make Trump's legacy particularly thin. The first is how little his administration accomplished in its first 2 years, despite unified control of Congress. Second, Trump's management of the executive branch has been detached enough to bog down any attempt to implement policy through executive action alone. The man cannot get a military parade. More serious policy changes are that much harder. And finally, Trump's scandals pose a more existential threat to his presidency than all of the Obama administration's scandals combined. Trump's capacity to destroy is much greater than his capacity to create. The next president will have to devote considerable effort to cleaning up the current president's messes, but there will be very little policy to change after the first 100 days of a new administration. There is simply not that much Trump policy to alter. And I find that this interesting because I was saying this a long time ago, and not to go, oh, well, I said this before. I mean, I did, and you can go back and find proof in earlier shows, particularly around the election when Trump was winning and when I was really depressed about that. I felt then, and I still agree with this guy now, this guy, by the way, who is a professor of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. So not an unsmart dude. But anyway, my point being that I was saying this about Trump, and I was also saying this about the last election when Ricardo and I had our sort of post-election chat, was that the only really effective person so far in the Trump administration was Jeff Sessions. And he was pretty effective. He did a lot, and he got a lot done, and he really created some problems that are going to be difficult to undo. But Trump himself generally has done very little. Virtually everything that was done and was accomplished, as this guy mentioned, was by the Republican, unified Republican government. And so basically Mitch McConnell getting judges through. I mean, that's been basically all that he's done so far. The tax cut was a big deal. But it was so unsuccessful and so damaging that it's going to have to be undone in one way or another as time goes forward, no matter who is in charge. They're going to have to fix it or do stuff to it because it's creating a huge deficit and creating big problems. So what they're going to try to do, of course, is, hey, let's take all of this out of, Social Security and Medicare and all those things, despite the fact that those things are funded in an entirely different way. So that's not coming out of tax dollars anyway. But they're still going to try to make that case. But even if they were able to make that case, they're still going to, sooner or later, presumably, have to address the fact that they've cost government so much money that it's going to need to make up that shortfall somehow. You can't keep raising the budget of the military forever and cutting taxes, because sooner or later, there's no money for the one, and you're going to have to get it from somewhere. So, wow. I'm really wondering if you can hear this, because it's so incredibly loud. I don't know what it is, but it sounds like a marching band has fallen down a well and they're still playing on their way down. It's something like that. It's really strange. Something's going on in the other room. Let me explain to the listener. The WRFU studios are located at the IMC, which is the Independent Media Center here in downtown Urbana. A number of things take place in this building. And one of the things that seems to be taking place at this moment in the other room is, I'm guessing it's a musical performance of some sort, or someone rehearsing, and it's very loud, and it's just kind of free form. So it's not music as most people would think of music. It's more sound sculpture, if you will. Someone is creating interesting sounds with what sounds like a guitar and maybe a lot of special effects on it. There may be singing going on there as well. I can't quite tell. In any event, it's if you're interested in that sort of thing, come on down to the IMC and check it out, because it sounds interesting. And if I weren't here on the radio and I didn't have other things to do, I would probably be listening to it because I'm curious about it. But be that as it may, I keep commenting on it because I'm trying to be on the radio here, and it's so loud I feel like you can't help but hear it. It's showing up on the meters anyway, so in any event, it may not be coming through to you, but it is certainly making its way through my headphones into my ears, and it's possibly the loudest thing I've ever heard here at the IMC in all my many years of being here. Okay, so there is singing going on. So yeah, it is a musical performance of some sort, and we're missing it. We're sitting here talking about immigration, but that's okay. This is an important topic, and hopefully they'll put out a record and you can hear them some other time. So talking about migration and migrants and immigrants and such, and Trump policies, you might think that because Trump is so anti-immigration and putting in so many anti-immigrant policies that immigrants would not be coming here. But you would be wrong. And to that effect, we have this New York Times article entitled "Asylum Claims Jump Despite Trump's Attempt to Limit Immigration." So the number of migrants asking the United States for asylum out of fear of returning to their home countries jumped nearly 70% from 2017, according to Department of Homeland Security data released on Monday, despite Trump administration efforts to limit refugees. Nearly 93,000 asylum seekers who crossed the border illegally or turned themselves in at official ports of entry in 2018 cited a credible fear of being targeted because of their race, religion, nationality, political opinions, or social group. And as we noted earlier, probably climate change as well. This is up from nearly 56,000 migrants who asked for asylum last year because they feared returning home, the data shows. Nearly 60% of all foreigners asking for asylum were people in families, according to officials with Customs and Border Protection, an agency within the Department of Homeland Security. Agency officials attributed the increase to smuggling organizations that exploit migrants' hopes with assurances that they will be able to stay in the United States if they falsely claim they fear going home. Immigration advocates, however, say the rise in asylum claims is a result of tens of thousands of people fleeing violence in Honduras and elsewhere in Central America. Homeland Security officials said the increase in migrants at the southwest border had overwhelmed an antiquated system that was not intended to handle large numbers of people at a single time. They said the ports of entry, many of which were opened decades ago, were devised to process men traveling alone, not families or transgender people. These numbers reflect a dramatic increase in initial fear claims by those encountered on the border, which is straining border security, immigration enforcement, and courts and other federal resources, said Kevin K. McAleenan, the Customs and Border Protection Commissioner. He said a majority of these claims will not be successful in the immigration process and called on Congress to overhaul the system. The agency is relying on a process called metering to limit the number of people who can be processed daily for asylum. Thousands of migrants are waiting on the Mexican side of the border as Customs and Border Protection officers process small numbers of people, 40 to 100 each day. Immigration advocates accuse the Trump administration of being more aggressive with the metering system than officials under former President Barack Obama to slow the flow of migrants at ports of entry. Since taking office nearly 2 years ago, Mr. Trump has railed against what he calls weak laws that allow migrants who are caught crossing illegally to claim asylum under false pretenses so they can be released into the United States. Because of a backlog in the immigration courts, migrants can sometimes wait for years for a judge to determine the validity of their asylum claim. Last month, the administration, invoking national security powers meant to protect the United States against threats from abroad, announced new rules that gave Mr. Trump vast authority to deny asylum to nearly all migrants who illegally enter the country. Those who showed up at ports of entry were not affected by the regulations. A federal court has issued a temporary restraining order against the new regulations, which draw upon the same authority Mr. Trump used just days after his inauguration to ban travel from several predominantly Muslim countries. They are among the many ways the administration has tried to cut the number of asylum seekers. In July, former Attorney General Jeff Sessions made it all but impossible for asylum seekers to gain entry into the United States by citing fears of domestic abuse or gang violence. Quote, An alien may suffer threats and violence in a foreign country for any number of reasons relating to her social, economic, family, or other personal circumstances, Mr. Sessions wrote. Yet the asylum statute does not provide redress for all misfortune, end quote. There we have a classic Mr. Sessions right there. We are so glad he's gone. Anyway, Mr. Trump has fumed for months about the surge of immigrants crossing into the United States from Mexico. In October, he ordered nearly 6,000 active duty troops to the southwest border to help Customs and Border Protection prevent the migrants from entering illegally. Just over 6,000 people in a caravan of migrants from Honduras have made their way to the border town of Tijuana. Late last month, a peaceful march by migrants waiting to be processed for asylum veered out of control as hundreds of people overwhelmed a Mexican police blockade and ran towards the border crossing that leads into San Diego. In response, officers with Customs and Border Protection shut down the border crossing in both directions and fired tear gas to push back migrants from the border fence. The border was reopened later that day. So the situation continues to become more and more fraught, particularly as Trump and company push back harder and harder to keep people out. So the pressures of people coming here, of the pressures pushing people to come here have increased. The pressures to keep them out have increased, and this is a recipe for possibly violence, certainly serious problems, and very difficult times for a number of people at the border. If we allowed more people in, as more people needed to come here, then the situation would remain basically the same. Or if we increased our aid to the places where people were coming from and helped them establish safer conditions at home, then they wouldn't come here. But that doesn't play well into the America First notion as Trump articulates it, which is we don't give anybody anything, we look out for ourselves, and we don't care what happens to anybody else, which is basically his modus operandi. So as that attitude and that stance plays out, it's going to create more situations where people are going to want to come here because we are not helping them where they're at. And then as they come here, we're pushing harder and harder to keep them out. And it's going to create more and more difficult times at the border, at every border. And it's just, it is a recipe for disaster. We can hope against hope that with the Dems taking over the House, at least there will be some pushback against all of this, or, to the extent that the House is allowed to do anything. They don't really have control over things like that, although they do have sort of control of the purse strings, and they can certainly limit the amount of money that goes into things like border enforcement. And so they can give a hard time. They can create a hard time, and hopefully they will. And that will hopefully at least mitigate the difficulties and create some easing of tensions in border areas and just all the, everything that's going on. Anyway, sorry about that. The band is kicking in again. My time has run out. I'm going to let you go, and I thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.